Secret societies in the early modern period, roughly 1400 to 1800, weren't primarily about mystical rituals or political conspiracies. They were about information, trust, and market access. And the most economically important secret societies were trade guilds, merchant networks, and religious diasporas that operated across borders using coded communications, exclusive membership, and insider knowledge to dominate particular markets and create information asymmetries that generated enormous profits. And while these organizations had public faces and legitimate functions, their most valuable assets were secret, the private knowledge of prices in distant markets, the trusted networks that enabled credit across thousands of miles, the insider techniques for evaluating quality or detecting fraud, the relationships with suppliers and customers that couldn't be easily replicated. And these secrets, carefully guarded and passed only to initiated members, created monopolies and oligopolies that shaped global trade patterns and concentrated wealth in the hands of those with access to the networks. And understanding how these secret societies operated, what information they controlled, how they maintained secrecy and exclusivity, and how they eventually lost their power reveals fundamental patterns about how information creates market power, how trust networks enable commerce, and how secrecy and exclusivity can be both economically efficient in the short term and ultimately unsustainable as information spreads and outsiders find ways to break in. And the legacy of these early secret trading societies persists today in everything from Masonic lodges that began as stonemason guilds to the ethnic trading networks that still dominate certain commodity markets to the exclusive clubs and informal networks that facilitate modern finance. All descended from or echoing the patterns established when secret knowledge meant market power and membership in the right society could make you wealthy beyond imagination. The medieval guild system was the original template. Guilds were associations of craftsmen or merchants in specific trades who controlled their markets through monopoly. In most European cities, you couldn't legally practice a trade without being a guild member, and becoming a member required years of apprenticeship and training and payment of fees and acceptance by existing members. And guilds controlled quality standards, pricing, production quantities, working conditions, and entry into the trade. This gave them enormous power. They could restrict supply to maintain high prices, could prevent competition from outsiders, could enforce quality standards that protected consumers, but also created barriers to entry. And crucially, guilds had secrets, trade secrets about techniques and materials and processes that were passed from master to apprentice, but never written down, never shared with outsiders. A guild member who revealed these secrets to non-members could be expelled, could lose their livelihood, and in some cases could face legal punishment. So guilds were literally secret societies in that they possessed and protected valuable information that wasn't publicly available, and this information monopoly was source of their economic power. If anyone could learn how to dye cloth purple or blow glass or work gold, the guilds would have lost their monopolies. But by keeping techniques secret, they maintained market power. The Hanseatic League was perhaps the most powerful commercial secret society of the medieval period. It was a confederation of merchant guilds and trading cities around the Baltic and North Sea, operating from roughly 1200 to 1600, and while it was publicly known to exist, its inner workings were secretive. The League had its own legal system, its own currency in some places, its own armed forces, and it controlled trade between Western Europe and Russia and Scandinavia through exclusive trading posts called contors, the most famous being in Novgorod, Bergen, Bruges, and London. And these contors were closed communities. Outsiders couldn't trade there, couldn't even enter the buildings without permission. Hanseatic merchants lived together, ate together, followed strict rules about who they could associate with and what information they could share. And they maintained detailed records of prices and quantities and trade routes that were kept secret from non-members. This information gave them enormous advantages. They knew what goods were scarce where, could anticipate price movements, could coordinate their trading to maximize collective profit, and they enforced discipline ruthlessly. Merchants who violated league rules or revealed secrets could be expelled, which meant losing access to the entire Baltic trade network, financial ruin. So the threat of expulsion maintained cohesion and secrecy. And for centuries, the Hanseatic League functioned as a transnational corporation before corporations existed, dominating Northern European trade through information monopoly and coordinated action. The techniques for maintaining secrecy were sophisticated, coded communications were common. Merchant letters would use ciphers or coded language to discuss prices and shipments, preventing competitors from gaining intelligence even if letters were intercepted, and merchants developed elaborate systems of marks and symbols, ways to indicate quality or origin or authenticity that only insiders could interpret, preventing fraud but also preventing outsiders from entering the trade, and there were physical secrets. Certain trade routes were kept secret. The Venetians carefully guarded the routes to their spice sources in the east. The Portuguese did the same with their routes around Africa to India. Revealing these routes to competitors would have eliminated their monopolies, so they were treated as state secrets. Maps were classified. Pilots who knew the routes were forbidden from working for rival powers, and violations could mean execution, and there were chemical and technical secrets. The formula for Venetian glass was a closely guarded secret. Glassmakers were essentially prisoners of the Venetian state, forbidden from leaving or sharing their knowledge. The Dutch had secrets about shipbuilding that made their ships cheaper and more efficient than competitors. The English eventually learned to replicate these designs, but it took decades of industrial espionage. All of this secrecy created information asymmetries that generated profit. The religious diaspora networks were particularly important and particularly secret. Jewish merchants operating across Christian Europe and the Islamic world, Armenian merchants spanning from Amsterdam to India, Huguenot merchants after the French Reformation. These communities maintained trading networks based on shared religion and ethnicity and often shared language and culture. And these networks operated on trust that couldn't be replicated by outsiders. A Jewish merchant in Venice could send goods to a Jewish merchant in Constantinople and trust that payment would be made, because both were embedded in a community where reputation mattered enormously and where cheating would result in exclusion from all future trade. This trust reduced transaction costs, eliminated the need for expensive legal enforcement, enabled credit across vast distances. And these networks were secretive not necessarily through formal rules, but through the natural exclusivity of tight-knit communities. Outsiders couldn't join, couldn't access the information flowing through the network, couldn't build the relationships and reputation needed to trade on the same terms. And this gave diaspora merchants advantages in certain trades. Jewish merchants dominated the diamond trade. Armenian merchants controlled much of the silk trade between Persia and Europe, and these dominances persisted for centuries because the network effects and trust relationships couldn't be easily replicated by outsiders. The Freemasons evolved from medieval stonemason guilds into something more elaborate and influential. Originally, they were simply guilds of craftsmen who built cathedrals and castles, and like other guilds they had trade secrets, techniques for cutting stone and designing arches and maintaining structural integrity, and these were passed through degrees of initiation, apprentice to journeyman to master, with each degree learning more secrets. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in Britain, Freemasonry evolved. It began accepting members who weren't actual stonemasons, wealthy and influential men who valued the fraternity and networking opportunities, and Masonic lodges became places where merchants and nobles and professionals could meet on relatively equal footing, exchange information, make business deals, and Freemasonry spread across Europe and to the Americas. And while the rituals and symbols became more elaborate and mystical, the practical function remained networking and information sharing. Masonic membership gave access to a network of trusted individuals who would preferentially do business with each other, who would share information about opportunities and risks, who would provide credit and support to fellow members. And this was valuable. Being a Mason in 18th century London or Philadelphia or Paris meant having business advantages, access to capital and markets and information that non-members lacked. And while Masonic lodges weren't exclusively or even primarily about commerce, the commercial benefits of membership were significant, and many successful merchants and bankers were Masons, using the network to advance their businesses. The East India Companies, both English and Dutch, operated with levels of secrecy that would be illegal today. They were monopolies, granted exclusive rights by their governments to trade in Asia, and they guarded their monopolies fiercely. They kept trade routes secret, navigational information was classified, They prevented their employees from trading independently, required them to sign contracts forbidding private trade under penalty of severe punishment. They manipulated information about prices and availability to maximize profits, would spread false rumors about scarcity to drive up prices or about abundance to drive down prices they were paying to suppliers, and they engaged in corporate espionage against each other, trying to steal information about routes and sources and techniques. And internally, these companies were secretive. Ordinary shareholders didn't know details of operations, didn't know what the companies were paying for goods or selling them for. The directors had enormous information advantages over shareholders and used these to enrich themselves at shareholders' expense. And the company's relationships with Asian suppliers and rulers were kept secret. The terms of agreements weren't public. The gifts and bribes paid weren't disclosed. The companies operated with minimal accountability, and this secrecy enabled enormous profits and also enormous abuses. The companies became essentially autonomous, more powerful than many states operating their own armies and administrations. And they did this through information control, by knowing what others didn't, by coordinating internally while keeping outsiders ignorant. And this worked for centuries until eventually the abuses became so extreme that governments intervened and stripped the monopolies, but not before the companies had accumulated fortunes and shaped global trade patterns. The techniques modern corporations use for maintaining competitive advantage, trade secrets and patents and non-disclosure agreements and confidential business information, these are all descendants of the practices developed by early modern secret trading societies. The basic insight is the same. That information asymmetry creates profit opportunities, that knowing what others don't know allows you to buy low and sell high, to avoid risks others face, to access opportunities others can't see. And that maintaining this information advantage requires secrecy, requires preventing information from spreading to competitors, and modern business law recognizes this, protects trade secrets, enforces NDAs, allows companies to maintain confidential information, but it also limits secrecy, requires public disclosure of certain information for publicly traded companies, prohibits insider trading, enforces antitrust laws against monopolies. So modern capitalism has found a balance, more openness than medieval guilds, but more secrecy than pure market theory would suggest optimal. And this balance reflects the tension between the efficiency of information sharing and the incentive effects of allowing information advantages. If companies couldn't keep any secrets, couldn't protect their innovations and techniques, they'd have less incentive to innovate. But if they could keep everything secret, could maintain permanent monopolies, competition would disappear and markets would fail. So the modern system tries to protect temporary information advantages while preventing permanent ones. And this is directly descended from lessons learned from the secret trading societies of the early modern period. The decline of secret trading societies came from multiple forces. The printing press made information harder to control. Knowledge that had been passed orally from master to apprentice could now be written down and disseminated widely. Books on trade techniques and navigation and manufacturing appeared, breaking guild monopolies. The rise of states with effective administrative capacity meant that guilds lost their monopoly on regulation. Governments could enforce quality standards and commercial law directly, didn't need to delegate these functions to guilds. The expansion of trade and the complexity of global markets meant that no single society could control enough information to maintain monopoly. There were too many routes, too many sources, too many participants for any one network to dominate, and ideological shifts toward free trade and competition undermined the legitimacy of monopolies. Adam Smith and other classical economists argued that guilds and monopolies were harmful, that free competition would produce better outcomes, and these ideas influenced policy, led to dismantling of guild privileges and trading monopolies. So by the 19th century, the formal secret trading societies had mostly disappeared. Guilds were abolished or transformed into professional associations without monopoly power. Trading monopolies were broken up, and markets became more open and competitive. But the informal networks persisted and persist today. Ethnic trading networks still dominate certain commodity markets. Indians in the diamond trade, Chinese in various manufacturing and trading networks, Lebanese in West African commerce. These networks aren't formal secret societies, but they function similarly, providing trust and information and access that outsiders can't easily replicate. And business networks and clubs and alumni associations serve similar functions, giving members access to information and opportunities and trusted relationships. And while these networks aren't secret in the sense that membership is hidden, they are exclusive. You can't just join. You need connections or credentials or wealth. And the information flowing through these networks, while not protected by formal secrecy rules, isn't publicly available, isn't accessible to outsiders. So the pattern continues. Networks based on trust and shared identity create information advantages that generate economic returns, and membership in the right networks remains valuable, perhaps more valuable than ever in an information economy where knowing the right people and having access to the right information matters more than owning physical assets. So in this sense, secret societies, or at least their functional equivalents, still influence markets, still create opportunities for insiders and barriers for outsiders, still concentrate wealth among those with access to networks and information. The question of whether these secret trading societies were beneficial or harmful is complex. On one hand, they were monopolies, suppressed competition, kept prices artificially high, excluded talented outsiders, maintained inequality, and resisted innovation that might threaten their privileges. The guilds that controlled medieval trades often prevented technological improvements that would have made production more efficient because efficiency meant needing fewer guild members and trading. Monopolies overcharged consumers and underpaid suppliers, extracting monopoly rents that enriched members at others' expense. On the other hand, these societies provided genuine benefits. They maintained quality standards that protected consumers from fraud. They trained workers systematically, ensuring skills were transmitted across generations. They provided social insurance for members, supporting them during illness or old age. They enabled trust and long-distance trade that might not have been possible otherwise. Without the trust networks of diaspora merchants, global trade would have been much more limited and expensive. So the secret societies were mixed. They created inefficiencies through monopoly, but they also created efficiencies through trust and coordination and information sharing. And eliminating them entirely might have thrown out the baby with the bathwater, losing the trust networks and quality control along with the monopoly rents, and perhaps the modern system, which preserves some network effects and information advantages while limiting monopoly power, is optimal or at least better than the alternatives. The influence of secret societies on early global markets was profound and lasting. They shaped trade routes and patterns, determined which goods moved where and at what prices, concentrated wealth in the hands of network insiders, created barriers to entry that maintained inequality, but also enabled the expansion of trade and the development of global markets by providing the trust and information infrastructure that formal institutions couldn't yet provide. In an era without reliable courts or enforceable contracts across borders, secret societies and exclusive networks provided the mechanisms that made commerce possible. And while they eventually became obstacles to further development and had to be dismantled or transformed, they served a crucial transitional function. They were the institutions that enabled early globalization, that connected distant markets and created the first truly global trading system. And their legacy persists in everything from Masonic lodges that still exist as fraternal organizations to the ethnic trading networks that still facilitate commerce to the informal business networks that still create information advantages. Secret societies didn't disappear. They just became less formal and less powerful. But the basic pattern remains, that exclusive networks with shared identity and information create economic advantages, that knowing what others don't know is profitable, that trust enables trade, and that secrecy and exclusivity, while economically inefficient in theory, serve practical functions in the real world of incomplete information and imperfect trust. So the secret societies that influenced early global markets weren't historical curiosities. They were prototypes for organizational forms that persist and will likely persist as long as information asymmetry and trust remain important in economic life, which is to say forever, making the study of these early secret trading societies not just historical interest but a way to understand how modern markets actually work beneath the surface, where information flows through networks rather than being freely available, where trust matters more than contracts, where membership in the right society or network or club creates opportunities and advantages that aren't accessible to everyone, and where secrecy, while diminished from the absolute information control that medieval guilds exercised, still creates value and power for those who possess information that others don't. The secret societies that shaped early global markets may be gone, but their spirit and their methods live on in modified form, influencing markets still, just more subtly and less visibly than when guilds could legally monopolize trades and trading companies could keep entire routes classified, but influenced nonetheless through networks and information and trust, the same mechanisms that secret societies pioneered centuries ago and that remain fundamental to how commerce operates today.